The morning Harriet Voss found the man lying face down in the snow. She almost walked past him. It was early February, the kind of cold that settles into your bones before you've even stepped outside, and Harriet had been up since 5 dealing with a broken water line in the barn. Her 2 children were still asleep in the house. Maisie, who was 7 and had her father's quiet eyes, and Peter, who was 9 and already trying too hard to be the man of the family. Harriet didn't have time for strangers. She didn't have time for much of anything these days. But the shape in the snow wasn't moving, and there was something about the stillness of it that stopped her cold. He was big, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy canvas coat that had done him no favors in the night. His hat had fallen a few feet away, half buried in a drift near the fence post. Harriet crouched down beside him and pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck, the way her mother had taught her when she was a girl growing up on the farm outside Gimli. There was a pulse, faint, but there. "Lord," she said out loud, to no one in particular. His face, when she turned him over, was badly bruised, jaw swollen on the left side, a cut above his brow that had bled, and then frozen in a dark streak down his temple. He looked to be in his mid-40s, maybe a few years past it, the kind of face that had spent a lot of time outdoors and hadn't been easy on itself. There was gray at his temples, and a few days of stubble along his jaw. He wore no wedding ring, though there was a faint pale line on his finger where one might have been once. Harriet stood up and looked back at the house. Then she looked down the long empty road that cut through the fields toward town. 14 kilometers to Millhaven. The truck needed antifreeze and she'd been putting it off. She looked at the man again. "All right," she said. It took her 20 minutes and more strength than she thought she had to drag him onto the old wooden sled she used for hauling wood, and another 10 to get him through the back door without knocking his head against the frame. She laid him on the kitchen floor beside the wood stove, pulled off his frozen boots, and covered him with the blanket from the back of the couch. Then she put the kettle on and went upstairs to wake the children. "Mom?" Maisie was already sitting up, hair tangled, clutching the stuffed rabbit she'd slept with every night since she was 3. "Why are your hands shaking?" "They're not," Harriet said. "Get dressed and tell your brother to come downstairs." His name was Cormac Elias Dunn. She found that out from the wallet in his inside coat pocket, along with a Manitoba driver's license and a worn photograph she didn't look at for more than a second before folding it back. There was also a business card, Dunn Timber and Land Holdings, Millhaven, MB, and a folded piece of paper with handwritten notes she couldn't make sense of. Cormac. She said it quietly to herself while she wrung out a cloth in warm water and dabbed at the cut above his eye. It felt strange to know a person's name before they'd chosen to give it to you. Peter stood in the doorway watching with his arms crossed, the way he'd started doing lately, trying to look like he wasn't worried. Maisie had stationed herself at the kitchen table with a cup of warm milk and her rabbit, and wasn't even pretending not to stare. "Is he dead?" Maisie asked. "No," Harriet said. "Is he going to die?" "I hope not. Should we call someone?" Harriet had already thought about that. The phone worked. She could call the RCMP detachment in Millhaven, or the clinic. She probably should. But there was something about the bruising on his face, the pattern of it, the way it spread along his jaw and up toward his cheekbone, that told her this hadn't happened from a fall. Someone had hit this man, more than once, and whoever had done it might not be finished. "Let's wait until he wakes up," she said, "and see what he has to say." Peter unfolded his arms. "Okay," he said, like that settled it. Cormac Dunn didn't wake up until late that afternoon. Harriet had moved him to the couch by then with Peter's help, and she'd changed the dressing on his forehead twice and gotten some broth into him with a spoon, while he was still half conscious, tilting his head, the way she'd done with the lambs when they were small and too weak to feed on their own. She'd done that without thinking about it, and later it occurred to her that she'd never told anyone that, and no one who looked at her from the outside would guess. She knew how. When his eyes finally opened all the way, they were dark brown, and for a moment they were completely blank. The eyes of a man who has no idea where he is, and is trying very hard not to show that it frightens him. Then he saw Harriet, sitting in the chair across from him with a cup of tea, watching him carefully. "Don't try to sit up yet," she said. "You've got a cracked rib, I'm pretty sure, maybe two, and whatever happened to your head, you were out in that cold for a while." He stared at her. "You're in my house," she said. "My name is Harriet Voss. I found you in my yard this morning." She paused. "Cormac." Something moved across his face when she said his name. Not surprise exactly, more like he was deciding something. "How do you know my name?" His voice came out rough, like sandpaper on old wood. "Your wallet." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Where are we?" 14 kilometers north of Millhaven, off the county road, my farm." He closed his eyes, opened them again. "The children." "Mine," she said. "My son and daughter. They're upstairs." He nodded slightly, like that was the right answer, and seemed to relax half a degree. "I didn't call anyone," Harriet said. "Yet." She let that word sit between them for a moment. "But I'd like to know what happened to you, if you feel up to telling me." Cormac Dunn looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he turned his head and looked at her directly, and she had the feeling he was doing the same thing she'd done when she found him, assessing, measuring, deciding. "You live out here alone?" he asked. "With my children. Your husband died 2 years ago." Something shifted in his face then. Not pity, she was grateful for that, because she couldn't stand pity. It was something quieter. Recognition, maybe. "I'm sorry," he said. "So am I," she said. "Now, what happened to you?" He told her some of it that night, and the rest came out over the following days, in the careful, rationed way of a man who had learned that telling the truth too fast could be used against you. The short version was this. Cormac had spent the last 3 years fighting a legal battle over a stretch of timber and wetland on the eastern edge of his property. Land his father had left him, land that 2 other men in the county had decided they wanted. One of them was a man named Gerald Swick, who ran the largest land brokerage in the region and had friends in enough places, and had friends to make legal trouble feel very small when you were standing in front of it. The other was Swick's business partner, a man Cormac, only referred to as Blackwood, said with a particular flatness that told Harriet everything she needed to know about what that man had done. "They've been pressuring you," she said. "It wasn't a question. Among other things. And the night I found you, 2 of Swick's people caught me on the road heading back from a meeting with my lawyer in town." He said it matter-of-factly, not asking for sympathy, just telling her what had happened the way you tell someone what the weather was like. "They took my truck, left me on the road." Harriet thought about the 14 kilometers between her farm and Millhaven, about February in Manitoba, about what it would have meant if she hadn't gone out to the barn when she did. "You could have died," she said. "I'm aware of that. Have you gone to the RCMP?" A pause. "Swick's nephew is the staff sergeant." Harriet put her tea down on the side table very carefully. "I see. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me," Cormac said. There was an edge to his voice, not unkind, but firm. "I'm telling you because you asked, and because you dragged me out of a snowbank and put me on your couch, and I think you deserve to know what kind of trouble you've opened your door to." She looked at him for a long moment. "Is the trouble going to come to my door?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "I hope not. I'll leave as soon as I'm able to walk without." He stopped, pressed his lips together. "Soon. You'll leave when you're well enough," Harriet said, "not before." He looked at her with something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't surprise. It was the look of a man who had expected to be turned away and wasn't sure what to do with the fact that he hadn't been. "Harriet," he said. Thank you." She picked up her tea again. "You can thank me by not dying on my couch." Maisie decided she liked Cormac on the second day, which was faster than she decided she liked most people. She brought him a drawing she'd done of a horse. She was obsessed with horses, though they hadn't had one since before Harriet's husband Will had gotten sick, and told him very seriously that she'd named the horse in the drawing Thunder, even though it was standing still. Horses can be still and still be thunder, Maisie explained. That's true, Cormac said, studying the drawing. The name's about what's inside. Maisie beamed. She came back an hour later with another drawing, this one of a dog, which she said she'd named Captain. Do you have a dog? Cormac asked. No, Maisie said sadly. Mom says we're not ready. Your mom knows what you're ready for. Maisie considered this. I think we're ready, she said. I'm just not sure she knows that we're ready. Cormac almost smiled. Harriet, who was in the kitchen and pretending she wasn't listening, felt something pull in her chest. Peter was harder, the way 9-year-old boys who've lost their fathers usually are. He watched Cormac from a distance for the first couple of days, bringing him water or extra blankets with the studied indifference of someone who absolutely did not care. On the third day, he came and sat on the far end of the couch and asked, without preamble, "Do you know how to fix things?" Cormac's brow shifted. What kind of things? The barn door hinge is broken, and there's a drip in the upstairs bathroom. Mom knows how to do most stuff, but the hinge is heavy and she's been tired. There was a silence. Give me a couple more days on the rib, Cormac said, and I'll look at both of them. Peter nodded, stood up, started to leave, then turned back. I'm Peter, by the way. I know, Cormac said. I heard your sister talk about you approximately 40 times. Peter almost smiled too. He caught himself and left the room. But Harriet could hear from the way his footsteps went up the stairs, lighter than they'd been, that something had shifted. She didn't let herself think about it too hard those first few days. She had a habit of not thinking about things too hard. It was how she'd gotten through Will's illness, and the funeral, and the 2 years that followed. You put your head down and you did what was in front of you. You fed the animals and got the kids to school and paid what bills you could and didn't look too far ahead, because too far ahead was where the fear lived. But at night, when the kids were in bed and the house was quiet and Cormac was asleep on the couch, she sat at the kitchen table and let herself feel the weight of everything she'd been carrying. Will had been a good man. A quiet man like her, which was why they'd worked. He'd known how to make her laugh without making her feel like she had to perform it. He'd been the one to push her to buy this farm when they were still young, and everyone thought they were being foolish. He'd said, "Harriet, we were made for open land," and he'd been right, even though he hadn't lived long enough to see what they could have made of it. She owed the bank 8 months of back payments. She'd been making small progress, slowly, a little more each season. But slowly wasn't going to be enough. If a hard spring followed a hard winter. She hadn't told the children. She hadn't told anyone. She didn't tell Cormac either. It wasn't his problem. But on the 5th morning, when he was up and moving around the kitchen, carefully, one arm pressed against his ribs, and she was making breakfast, he looked out the window at the yard and the barn and the fields beyond and said, quietly, "How long have you been running this alone?" 2 years, she said. How much land? 160 acres. Some of it's rented out. I've been working the rest myself with a bit of seasonal help. She cracked an egg. Why? He was quiet for a moment, just wondered. She could tell he'd noticed things. He was the kind of man who noticed things and didn't say them out loud, which she recognized because she was the same kind of person. She'd seen him looking at the fences in the yard, at the barn roof where one section of the metal had lifted and let in the cold. She wanted to tell him it wasn't his business, but somehow she couldn't summon the words, because he wasn't saying it was. On the 6th day, Gerald Swick's car came up the road. Harriet saw it from the kitchen window, a black SUV moving too slowly for someone who knew where they were going, too deliberately for someone who was lost. It stopped at the end of her laneway. "Cormac," she said. He was at her side in a moment, and when he looked out the window his jaw went tight. "Go upstairs," he said. "This is my house," she said. He looked at her. Then he nodded once. "Stay away from the windows." The man who got out of the SUV was not Gerald Swick. Cormac, told her that quietly. It was one of Swick's people. Younger, in a too-good coat for the weather, the kind of man who drove expensive vehicles but had no particular feeling for where he drove them. He knocked on the door. Harriet opened it. Cormac stood just inside, out of sight. "Mrs. Voss?" The man smiled with his mouth. "My name's Garrett. I work for Gerald's Swick. You might know the name. We're looking for a man who may have passed through this area about a week ago." Cormac Dunn. Big man, dark hair going gray. "We want to make sure he's all right." Harriet looked at him for a moment. She thought about what Cormac had told her. The truck taken, the road, the night. She thought about the bruise that had only just started to yellow at the edges. "I haven't seen anyone matching that description," she said. Garrett's smile didn't change. That was the tell. A real smile would have shifted when she answered. "You sure about that? It's a long stretch of road. Easy to miss things." "I'm on this road every day," Harriet said. "I don't miss things." He looked past her, just briefly. Then back. "Well, if you do happen to see him, or if he turns up, Mr. Swick would very much appreciate a call." He held out a card. She took it with 2 fingers. "Of course," she said. She closed the door. Behind her, Cormac let out a long, slow breath. "Well," Harriet said, setting the card on the table, "he'll know you're here by morning. Or he knows already." "Probably already," Cormac said. She turned to face him. "Then we need a plan." He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him recalibrating something. Adjusting whatever assumptions he'd made about her in the last 6 days. Who she was, what she was made of. "You don't have to be part of this," he said. "You're in my house," she said. "I'm already part of it." What Harriet didn't know, until Cormac told her that evening, was that he had something. He'd been careful about saying so, not from distrust but from the same instinct she had. You don't show your hand until you understand the table, but with Swick's man having been to the door, the timeline had shifted, and Cormac laid it out for her plainly. 3 weeks before the night she'd found him, he'd been approached by a man named Vincent Alderton, a land surveyor, semi-retired, who had worked for Swick's brokerage for nearly 15 years before walking away from it. Alderton had brought documents, survey records that had been altered, environmental assessments that had been filed under names that didn't exist. A chain of paper that, if it reached the right people, would unravel not just the case against Cormac's land but a dozen other deals Swick had pushed through in the county over the past decade. Alderton had given him copies. Cormac had left the originals with his lawyer. The lawyer had them in a lockbox, and the lockbox was registered, and the key was in a safety deposit account in Millhaven. But the lawyer's office had been broken into 2 days before. The men took Cormac's truck, and the lawyer himself had received what could charitably be called a very clear warning. "He hasn't given them the documents," Cormac said, "but he's frightened, and frightened men make bad decisions." "What do you need?" Harriet asked. Cormac looked at her steadily. "I need to get those documents to someone outside the county, someone who can take them to the Provincial Land Registry office in Winnipeg, or to the Federal Integrity Commissioner's office. Swick doesn't have reach there, at least not yet. That's 8 hours round trip in this weather." "I know." Harriet was quiet for a moment. She thought about Maisie and Peter upstairs, doing their homework, completely unaware of the conversation happening in the kitchen below them. She thought about the man at her door with his coat and his card and his empty smile. Then she thought about Will, who had always said that the worst thing a person could do was look away when they knew the right thing. "I can drive," she said. "Harriet, my neighbor Bev takes the kids on Friday afternoons. They go for supper and a movie, and they don't come home until 9. That's tomorrow." She paused. "If you think you can sit in a truck for 4 hours. He looked at her for a long moment. "I can sit in a truck," he said. The drive to Winnipeg was cold and clear, the highway cutting through flat white land that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The kind of landscape that looked empty to people who didn't know how to see it, and looked like everything to people who did. Harriet drove. Cormac sat in the passenger seat with the folder of documents on his lap and didn't say very much for the first hour. That was fine. She didn't need conversation. She'd made this drive alone 100 times. Somewhere past Portage la Prairie, he said. Tell me about your husband. She glanced at him. Why? Because you've listened to me talk about my trouble for a week, and it occurs to me I haven't asked you anything. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Will was a farmer, 7th generation. His family was from Manitoba, going all the way back to when there wasn't much here except the land itself. He knew this province the way people used to know things, not from reading about it, but from being in it. She paused. He was sick for 14 months. In that whole time, I don't think I heard him complain once. Cormac was quiet. He used to say that the land would outlast all of us, and the best you could do was try to deserve a little piece of it for a while. She smiled slightly, looking at the road. He said that about the farm. I think he believed it about most things. Sounds like a good man. He was the best man I knew. Another silence, but it was the comfortable kind. The kind that exists between people who have stopped performing ease and found the real thing underneath. My wife's name was Eleanor, Cormac said. It came out quietly, like something he'd been carrying in his hands for a long time and had decided to set down for a moment. She died 4 years ago. Cancer. We were married 11 years. Harriet didn't say she was sorry. He would have heard it 1,000 times. She just said, "You must miss her every day." Every day, he said. Yes. The highway ran straight ahead of them. 2 lanes of pale gray between the white fields, and the sky above it was the deep, endless blue of a Manitoba winter afternoon. They made it to Winnipeg by 2 o'clock. Cormac's contact at the provincial land registry had been warned they were coming. A woman named Constance Weller, who turned out to be exactly the kind of person you hoped would be on the other end of something like this. Unhurried, precise, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the particular expression of someone who had spent 30 years watching people try to get away with things and found it genuinely tiresome. She looked at the documents for 15 minutes without speaking. Then she looked up. These were filed through Swick brokerages. Through a shell company, Cormac said. The names on the assessment filings are listed in the 3rd tab. She looked at the 3rd tab. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes went very still. We'll need the originals, she said. My lawyer has them. He'll release them to your office, if he can be assured it won't come back to him directly. I'll make a call, she said. She stood up, held out her hand to Cormac, then to Harriet. I won't promise you a timeline, but I'll tell you this, what you've brought here isn't small. I know, Cormac said. Good. She walked them to the door. Drive safe. The roads west of Portage will be a siki by tonight. They were back in Millhaven by 8. They didn't go to the farm right away. Cormac asked her to stop at the law office, where his lawyer, a small nervous man named Aldrich, who answered the door in his coat like he'd been standing near it, handed over an envelope with shaking hands and looked like a man who had not slept properly in 2 weeks. Is it done? He asked. It started, Cormac said. Aldrich nodded. He looked at Harriet, then back at Cormac. I'm sorry, he said quietly. For not, you held it, Cormac said. That's what mattered. They drove the 14 kilometers back to the farm in the dark. When Harriet turned down the laneway and the house came into view, the windows lit from inside where Bev had dropped the kids off early, she felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched. Peter was still up, doing homework at the kitchen table. He looked up when they came in and assessed the situation with the careful eyes of a 9-year-old who had learned to read rooms. Did something happen? He asked. We went to the city, Harriet said. Everything's fine. Peter looked at Cormac. Your face looks less bad, he said. Thanks, Cormac said. That's the most encouraging thing anyone said to me in weeks. Peter went back to his homework, but there was a small, barely visible twitch at the corner of his mouth. The investigation into Gerald Swick's land dealings was opened by the provincial office 6 weeks later. Harriet heard about it the way you hear about most things in a small Manitoba town. Through the grain co-op, through Bev, through the half-dozen people you run into at the hardware store who all know who you are and who you're connected to, and put the pieces together without asking directly. The RCMP detachment in Millhaven got a new acting staff sergeant in March, which was a different kind of news but ended up in the same conversation. By April, the legal action against Cormac's land had been formally stayed pending the investigation. His truck turned up in a yard, outside town, mostly intact in a way that suggested whoever had it had decided the truck was less important than their other problems. Cormac had stayed in Millhaven through all of it, not on Harriet's couch, which had never been the long-term arrangement, but in a rented room above the hardware store that his lawyer had quietly arranged. He came by the farm most weekends. He fixed the barn door hinge and the bathroom drip, and then he noticed the section of barn roof that was lifting and came back the following Saturday, with materials and 2 hours of daylight, and got most of it done before the light went. Peter helped. He didn't say much while they worked, but he handed up tools with a focus and steadiness that made Cormac tell Harriet afterward that her son had a real instinct for it. "He told me once he wanted to be an engineer," Harriet said. "He should," Cormac said simply. "He's got the mind for it." It was small things like that. The kind of things that accumulated without anyone deciding they were going to. Maisie, for her part, had declared Cormac her second best friend, after her school friend Nadia, and informed him of this ranking with the seriousness of a formal appointment. He'd accepted the title with equal seriousness, which Maisie found entirely satisfying. It was a Sunday in late May when Harriet finally let herself look at the thing she'd been not looking at for months. They were sitting on the back step after supper, the kids inside watching something on the tablet, the fields green for the first time since she'd found him in the snow, and Cormac had just told her that the bank holding his accounts had released the freeze that Swick had somehow managed to engineer through a third-party claim. "So it's clearing," she said. "Slowly. But yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've been thinking about the east parcel." She looked at him. "The land my father left me. Part of it borders County Road. I've had a few people express interest in it over the years. Proper interest, I mean. Not Swick's kind." He paused. "I don't want to sell it, but there's something else I've been thinking about." "Which is?" He turned to look at her. Direct the way he always was. He had the quality of a man who had learned that the most merciful thing was usually to say the thing plainly. "You're 8 months behind with the bank," he said. She went very still. "I heard it from Aldrich, and I don't apologize for that, because I think you know. I'm not asking about it to embarrass you." He paused. "I also think you've known since the winter that I was going to say something, and you've been waiting to see if I was the kind of man who would." She looked at the fields. The light was going gold at the edges the way it did in late May, the kind of evening that made you understand why people chose to stay in Manitoba when they could have gone somewhere easier. "I don't want charity," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not offering it." She looked at him. "I have more land than I can work," he said. "You have the labor and the equipment and the knowledge, and you're running short on capital. There's an arrangement in that, if you want to look at it. A business arrangement. A partnership," he said, "if you want to call it that." She was quiet for a long time. The word partnership sat between them in the May evening air, and meant, she understood, more than he was saying out loud, and also exactly what he was saying out loud, and she appreciated that he'd given her room to take it however she needed to. "I'd need to understand the terms," she said. "Of course, and I'd need it written out properly. I'm not signing anything I haven't read 3 times. I would expect nothing less." She looked at him again. He was looking at the fields, and there was something in his profile in the evening light. Something in the set of his shoulders, the steadiness of him, that reminded her, not painfully but softly, of Will. Not because he was like Will. He wasn't, not really. He was a different man in almost every way, but there was that quality they shared. That quality of a person who had decided what they believed and didn't need to announce it, who would do the right thing, not because anyone was watching, but because they couldn't imagine doing otherwise. "Cormac," she said. I'm glad I didn't walk past you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, without looking at her, "So am I, Harriet. So am I." Inside the house, Maisie's laugh rang out, bright and sudden and unguarded, the laugh of a child who doesn't yet know that the world gives you reasons to hold it back. Peter said something in response, low and dry, and Maisie laughed again. Harriet and Cormac sat on the back step in the late May light, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and that was enough. In September, they planted the east field together for the first time. Peter drove the smaller tractor, carefully, with Cormac walking alongside, and Maisie sat on the fence with a thermos of hot chocolate that she'd made herself and handed out with great ceremony to anyone who came within reach. The sky was the particular blue of a prairie September, the kind that goes all the way to the edges, and the air smelled of turned earth and the coming cold and something else that Harriet couldn't name exactly, but recognized as the feeling of a life putting itself back together. Not into what it was before, because it never goes back to exactly what it was before, but into something real and solid, and worth the tending. She stood at the edge of the field and watched the three of them, and thought about Will, and thought about how he would have liked this man, would have shaken his hand and said something quiet and true, the way Will did with people who deserved it. And she thought, we were made for open land. She'd believed it when Will said it. She believed it still,